Welcome, everybody. I'm excited today to introduce Stand.earth and Todd Paglia. In the tech industry, we have this notion of the frenemy, two companies that compete in one area and partner in another area. And Stand.earth has taken that approach to environmental activism. And their approach is to say, we'll help companies clean up their act and act responsibly with respect to the environment and show them how to do that. But if they don't, then we'll bring the righteous wrath of the public down upon them. And I think this is a great approach, and it's proven to be very successful. Stan has had great success in transforming the paper industry to use forests more responsibly, and in saving the great rainforest. We saw some of the pictures up there from when I got a chance to accompany them up to British Columbia. And let's let Todd tell you all about it and about some of the opportunities where we can help in this mission by bringing some of the technologies that we have in mapping and satellites and so on. Todd, welcome to Google.
Thanks so much for being here today. I want to take you back to the founding of Stand.earth, which was in the mid-1990s, about 1,000 miles north of here on the west coast of Canada. There was a line being drawn in the sand in a place called Clayoquot Sound. A small town of Tofino is in Clayoquot Sound. It was the last old-growth rainforest valley on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and the people had had enough. They began organizing to try to stop the logging of this area, and it's a rainforest valley of just incredible beauty. 1,000-year-old western red cedar trees, Doug firs, trees so big that 10 people linked arm to arm could barely wrap their arms around the trunks of these trees. And they're being cut down to make toilet paper, newsprint, 2x4s, and other products. So the organizers started what was a very small effort in the beginning, and little by little gained momentum, getting people out to this remote area to actually put their bodies on the line to try to stop the bulldozers and the logging trucks from coming in. And this, for whatever reason, it was partly the time, partly so much had been lost already, people responded. This struck a nerve, and hundreds of people showed up, and little by little, thousands of people showed up. And they began organizing protests to try to stop the logging. The media followed. It became known as the War in the Woods. Went on for months, and celebrities started showing up, and rock stars, and everybody wanted to come and get arrested and stand on the line with the protesters protecting this old-growth river valley. And it culminated with just a sort of international media storm. 1,000 arrests, the biggest civil disobedience in Canadian history, and it didn't work. It wasn't enough. And it was from that sort of exceeding all expectations, every goal they set as far as turnout, media, everything they did went way beyond their goals, and they still didn't stop the logging. McMillan Bloedel, the logging company, just kept moving right along. And it was from that sort of moment of desperation that the organizers, the founders of Stand.earth, decided to think about who was buying this stuff. So something's driving what's happening. So they took a very basic approach and went out to the marketplace with hundreds of letters to any company they thought might somehow be connected to the logging in Clayoquot Sound and the broader logging on the coast of British Columbia. And companies were concerned. They didn't realize that their purchasing dollars were destroying this rainforest. And for the first time in British Columbia, and logging was king in British Columbia and had been for decades, for the first time, the logging company was on its heels. The logging stopped. They started having to answer questions to their customers. They started having to work to keep contracts. They started to lose some contracts. The companies not wanting to be part of what was happening in Clayoquot Sound. And that was the first time that the companies were really put on the defensive. And The trees of Clackamas Sound, the old growth forests of Clackamas Sound, are still standing to this day because of that effort at the tail end of years of protest to bring some transparency. And I think it was this little glimpse of transparency of a tree in a forest being cut, 5 or 6 different mills, way stations, middlemen, 2 big branded companies at the other end. And it was just a little bit of glimpse of transparency that changed the entire equation. So we took that lesson of Clackamas Sound and started thinking, so how do we build campaigns from the front end that, yes, use communications, organizing, protests, all the traditional tools, but also start to bring some transparency to the issues we were taking on. So from one old-growth rainforest valley, we decided to try to protect 100 old-growth rainforest valleys in an area known at that time as the Mid-Coast Timber Supply Area. Quite a catchy name. First piece of business for the groups working on this, and there were a lot of other organizations beyond Stand, including NRDC and Greenpeace and Rainforest Action Network and many others. The first piece of business was to rename it. We renamed it the Great Bear Rainforest after the spirit bear, which is the iconic symbol of the Great Bear Rainforest. It's the only place in the world where 1 out of every 10 black bears is born white. They're not albinos, they're not polar bears, they're actually a white bear, known as the spirit bear and revered by the First Nations who have lived in this landscape for thousands of years. And we started building into the campaign transparency, trying to track from this very remote area, wood, paper, pulp, all the way through the entire system to big branded companies. So we had 100 valleys, 3 companies, and literally thousands of big branded companies buying the product at the end of the line, and they had no idea they were doing that. So it was a major sort of private eye investigation effort to figure out where all this stuff went to, and then to begin educating the companies. Our methods got a little bit better at that point. We went from just sending a scattershot letter to hundreds of companies to actually tracking the wood, paper, and pulp using a bunch of different methods, some of which meant just going to mill towns and hanging out in the bar and figuring out where the customers were. So folks at the bar would say, hey, we just got a big order from Home Depot, we just got a bigger order from Staples. We also ended up using, anybody remember the LoJack car device? So we would use the LoJack, which would track your stolen car. So we would track our stolen forests and use that sort of device to track from especially rail shipments all the way to the big branded companies. And little by little, we sort of chipped away at the transparency problem we were having. And a lot of companies, just like in Clackamas Sound, didn't want to be part of destroying a rainforest. Over time, it became millions of dollars of contracts put on the line to tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts put on the line. And using that power, we were able to bring industry to the table. At the same time, First Nations on the coast of BC, for the first time in a long time, got organized in a way that went beyond individual First Nations. They became a collective known as the Coastal First Nations. In British Columbia, they have not signed treaties. So they have actual, somewhat undefined, but very powerful right to title. And so they became a political force of their own while we were driving the marketplace towards change. And through a series of negotiations, we went from the starting point, which you can barely see here on the screen, but almost no protection in the Great Bear, to a third of it being protected. 2005, we got to around 2009, we got to 50%. 2015, we put the final details into place to get over 80% of the Great Bear Rainforest protected, off limits to logging, and we created fiber sort of flow processes for the logging companies to have a lower impact, but be able to maintain their businesses. So it was a real win-win, and what we found is once First Nations, environmental groups, and industry were on the same page with a very detailed plan, the government was more than happy to move forward and move that into permanent legislation. So using these methods of really increasing and building transparency into our campaigns, we've been able to move around 60 million acres of old growth and endangered forest towards protection over the last 2 decades. And we then started getting pulled increasingly into climate change. One of the first issues that we had to address, right sort of in the middle of this map, there was a pipeline proposal by the Enbridge Corporation to bring a giant tar sands pipeline right at the point when we were going over 50% of the Great Bear protected, heading towards 80. They thought it would be a great time to bring a giant pipeline right into the Great Bear Rainforest, bringing hundreds of tankers into the Great Bear Sea. This was a fight that went on for the better part of a decade. We were able, largely through the leadership of First Nations groups, to beat that pipeline back, tremendous organizing on the ground, and this movement of people all around North America and beyond fighting oil infrastructure has had incredible success. You've all heard about the Keystone Pipeline, which has been beaten a couple of times by now, the Enbridge Pipeline. We're in the midst of the fight of our lives with the Kinder Morgan Pipeline coming into Vancouver, the Port of Vancouver. We're hopefully going to be able to turn that back. But as we, as a movement, succeeded on pipelines, the oil companies developed a plan B. The plan B was oil trains. So if they couldn't get their pipelines through, and they were getting delays and defeats on pipelines, they thought they might be able to start moving oil by rail, and this took everybody by surprise. This was something that heretofore oil would occasionally go on rail, but not very often and not in any quantity that mattered. And suddenly you were getting, about 5 years ago, thousands of % increase every single year. And suddenly there were more than 24 oil by rail terminals, new terminals being sited all across North America. So what we did is we were far too small to take on this challenge ourselves. We started partnering with frontline communities, developed a network, Crude Awakening Network, which is 275 groups strong at this moment. Everything from a couple of people working at their kitchen table to the Sierra Club and Natural Resources Defense Council. Banding together, we were able to begin to push back on this threat. And one of the key components, though, was getting back to the issue of transparency. We created a tool called the blastzone.org. And this is a map. We're somewhere over in here, outside of the blast zone. As more and more oil by rail was being shipped, the trains had a tendency to explode more and more often, usually because a lot of the rails are in somewhat isolated areas. There were not a lot of deaths, thank God, but in some places there were. In Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, 47 people lost their lives in an oil train explosion. We had a number of very close calls with, for example, an oil train turning over in a tunnel in Seattle during the summer. It didn't ignite, but there were so many close calls and so many communities were up in arms and trying to fight this that we created this tool. And it was really kind of the next iteration of transparency for us. This wasn't just information we were trying to get for ourselves. It was information that we were trying to get and then sort of unleash it and see what people did with it. So you could put in any address anywhere in North America and find out how far you were from the blast zone, which is the federally defined area where you can see from red, this is basically almost sort of an incineration zone to an evacuation zone. You don't want to be near any one of those. And they go right through many of our cities and towns. So this was an incredible mobilizing tool. We were able to allow groups all over North America to use it, and they got the attention of the mayor when the mayor's house was in the blast zone. The city councilor's house was in the blast zone, when their school children, when the school was in the blast zone. And it also led to a number of reports that had never been possible before, including many of the areas that we were working on, like this picture here, were in very low income areas. And so we were able to actually use demographic data, partnering with environmental justice groups to show for some of the new terminals who was at risk. In many of these places, it was 80, 90% and higher low income communities and communities of color. This also became a huge rallying point for these communities to push their elected leaders to reject the oil train terminals. And over the course of a few years, we were able to, with this network, to beat over 20 oil train terminals and really answer a threat that was sort of popping up everywhere in an incredibly effective way. And a lot of it really came down to transparency and access to information. The blast zone has been one of the best tools we've ever come up with, and it's the kind of thing that is really way out there for groups like us. It is an outlier, and it's something that we actually need to see a lot more of, I think, in the future. Our work on climate change has gone from oil infrastructure now more and more into changing industries. We have a new campaign actually launched as of this morning on the fashion industry. The fashion industry itself is the 5th largest contributor to climate change if it were a nation. So that's about 5.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And again, like we've learned over time, we're trying to build more and more transparency into this system, and there's a new sort of fledgling effort by a couple of our allies, IPEI, which is a group run by Ma Jun, the Goldman Environmental Prize winner, and NRDC is partnering with this effort as well, for the first time to map factories in China and the brands associated with them. So you'll see Puma, New Balance, Target, and this is a voluntary effort. Spree is also part of this effort. It's a voluntary effort to begin to show where they're making the shoes and apparel that they manufacture. And this is paired with real-time pollution monitoring data. So any lack of compliance is going to be known, and local people on the ground can access this and actually go to the factories and see what's happening. And the photographic and other information you can get when a mill is out of compliance will lead directly to a complaint to the company that is the ultimate buyer of what that factory makes. And I think this is the very beginning of what's going to change the apparel sector. We launched our campaign. Our part of this is we launched our campaign actually a few hours ago at Levi's in San Francisco, the iconic California jeans company, and we are encouraging them to get on the pathway to Paris. I think part of how they are going to be part of the broader campaign is to set a real goal to reduce their climate impacts. This campaign is well timed because it's very possible. And in fact, they have a mill that's waterless. They can be running their mills not on coal, but on alternative energy. And this is an effort that we think will drive companies to produce real long-term commitments and begin mapping their supply chains. They're incredibly complex, and there's no way they or officials in China can possibly monitor it and keep tabs on whether or not they're in compliance. But this network of groups working on climate issues and local pollution issues can. So I think this is really a whole new world when we're looking at what's possible for mapping and giving access to ordinary citizens, to say nothing of local government officials, about what's happening in their homes, their towns and cities that might impact them. And so over time, over the last 2 decades, I think that there's this trend. This is a very imperfect calculation, the kind only a liberal arts major would come up with. But I really think that our work has shown over the last couple of decades that transparency plus strategy equals change. And we are people like me, who are lawyers, campaign strategists, media people. That's most of what the environmental movement is about, and lawyers and other folks. And I think we need to increasingly build a bridge to folks like some of the people in this audience who know how to manage data, capture data, and provide simple access to people to be able to see what's happening in their homes, what's happening in the world, what's happening with the companies that they do business with. And I think this is the recipe for change that we really have to look at. When I look at Clayoquot Sound, the Great Bear Rainforest, the oil train work, everything we've done for 2 decades as a pretty small group, we've been able to move millions of acres to protection, change industries, and transparency has been a big part of it. In the next decade, you all know we have a huge challenge in front of us with climate change and many other issues. I think that to the extent that we can get folks that are sort of campaigners working with folks that are coders with common cause to try to map and provide access to information for some of our greatest challenges. That's going to be how we provide the world we want to hand off to our kids and to the next generation. And here's to campaigners and coders working together. Thank you so much for listening. So that's the formal presentation. We're actually hoping to get into a little bit of dialogue, because I think you people who work at Google and other tech industries probably know and have ideas about things that we would never even think of. So I wanted to, if you folks think about what you do and some of the things that we're trying to do, there's a bunch of issues that we're taking on beyond the apparel sector, including a new campaign against just the shipping sector. I'll just give you one quick story. Working with some indigenous groups in Alaska, in the Alaskan Arctic, whose livelihoods, their culture depends upon hunting and fishing, and the biggest single threat to them is cruise ships coming into their areas. It would be a huge thing if they just knew when the ships were coming and what ship it was and when they were arriving, when they were leaving, and there are ways to do that through different mapping and commercial vessel traffic monitoring tools. But like how you take that information and actually get it to something that's usable for somebody in a First Nations community, indigenous community, so that they can sort of begin to manage this risk while we put pressure on Carnival to stay out of there. It's just one of the many things where we're like, somebody could figure this out. But we can't. So I wanted to just open it up and see if you have, first of all, questions or ideas on how sort of campaigners and coders might work together to tackle some of these things.
Thank you very much for coming and for your presentation. And I think that you and I should talk later, longer. I lead the Google Earth outreach team here at Google, and where our mission is to empower everyone to use Google's mapping tools to change the world in a positive way. And we focus on different social and environmental issues. And I won't take up this whole time. It's not my podium, but fishing, yeah. So you may have heard of Global Fishing Watch. Mm-hmm. So our team did that. And what a cool idea to repurpose that same data, apply different kinds of machine learning and proximity alerts to be able to give real-time updates to Indigenous communities in Canada or wherever. Mm-hmm. We work very actively with the First Nations and Aboriginal groups in Canada, as well as New Zealand and Australia, and of course US and Brazil and many others. So I see a lot of things that could be repeated. And of course with Google, you want to start somewhere and then repeat it and scale it so that everybody can have access. And so there's that. I love that idea. So yes, we should talk. That's a very cool idea. Second, supply tracking is something that when we were at Rio Plus 20, and Rio Plus 20, it was really, I remember being in this panel with Unilever CEO and, Richard Branson, a couple others, and they were saying, the Consumer Goods Forum, and I know that's still active, and I know Consumer Goods Forum is doing great things for sustainable management of goods, but I feel like the tools out there aren't living up to people's needs, your needs for supply tracking. We've talked to Patagonia; they're like superior in their kind of mapping their supply chain for some of their products. Mm-hmm. They're also interested. So there's a big, huge desire for it, but it's super complicated. And I think even though Google has data, we're starting to understand that for our own, products, how to track our consumer goods, but we don't have the history and probably the breadth of knowledge that you have. So I'd love to have a conversation about that. How we can map those. What the map you have was fantastic, but then how do you map, how do you track? How do you tell that kind of story? And we're good at selling stories, but it's a different kind of story. And you can't just throw it into some story template. You got to really kind of understand pathways. And
it's not static. Each year there will be new factories on that map.
Yep.
And have to be flexible and able to adapt to changing circumstances on the ground.
That's right. Yeah, and the last question I'll have, and then I'll let somebody else talk, or you can keep going, is I would love to know, so I lead the effort to map air pollution worldwide and get that data into everybody's hands. Mm-hmm. And one of that is just there's the lack of measurement, so we're trying to help that too. And so I would love to know, when you talk about pollution, have you heard of the Lancet group, Pure Earth? Yeah. They were part of the Lancet report that just recently reported that like 1 in 5 people die of pollution. Right. There's lots of different kinds of pollution, but 1 in 5 people die of pollution in the world. Yeah. And what's interesting about that is they're trying to map it. So it might be an interesting collaboration there. But I would love to talk more about, like, when you said you connect those supply chain factories with pollution, what kind of pollution? Where do you get that data? Because in China, that's very sparse. I mean, air is one thing. I know about air, but I don't know about other pollution.
Well, so they're actually, and this is largely the work of IPEI, which is a very small group like us. But they have been able to access, there's not a lot being done with the information. It's real-time water pollution information on a bunch of different chemical outputs, as well as air pollution. And because the government is relatively small and doesn't enforce, nobody does anything with that data, but it's there.
And who put that? Is it they put it on the factories? The factory voluntarily put it on their
the actual government is requiring it. Okay. And so what's happening is basically IPEI is tapping into that data and just beginning to map it. But it's not leading to any compliance efforts by the Chinese government. But when something gets out of compliance and people email these companies directly, it gets fixed, right? So that, expanding on that and having somebody other than us and IPEI and NRDC doing this would be incredible.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What does IPEI stand for again?
Well, in Chinese it makes a lot more sense.
Okay, yeah. Okay, cool. I'll follow up on, we can talk more about ideas together.
That sounds great. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I also like to second, I love the idea of transparency as a tool to allow people to do what they want to do and know is right. I'm part of the GEO organization, and my teams do the aerial and satellite and street view geometry and reconstruction of all over the planet. And I'm also heading up the nascent GEO augmented reality. And we are interested in what kinds of applications using augmented reality. So what this means is that Google has this incredible asset of a very rich, detailed physical model of the world. And we can marry that with people being able to create augmented or content, virtual content, and pin it to the world, and it's ACLed and shared appropriately. So as you're talking, I was thinking, boy, I could easily imagine applications of somebody holding up their device, or there might be headsets in the future, looking at the dress in the window and not just getting information about the cost and sizes and so forth, but the source of where the material came from, what factories, what the environmental footprint of that, and maybe even push a button that says, tell the manufacturer that you love this dress, but you'd love it even more if they were more responsible, something like that. So I would be very interested in talking with you and your team about what applications could be developed using this ability to augment a model of the physical world that's visible to anyone, and would give them more information about the products, maybe holding it up to factories, in the city to tell you what that factory is doing, and putting it right in the hands of people in their mobile devices. Yeah,
well, that's great. I mean, one of the things that's been incredible over the last year or so is that we've had so many more people wanting to be active, wanting to try to take control of the choices they make, what's happening in their cities and towns. And we've had, in some cases, add a 0 to the number of people showing up for a protest or demonstration. And so there's right now the appetite for people out there to actually have information they can take action on is higher than it's ever been in my 20 years of working on this stuff. So that would be an incredible tool to have.
And that's just one, this group also, and you're related to the sunroof group of identifying good areas for putting in solar panels. I mean, we could partner with stuff like that also, again, with augmented reality, where you could have virtual landmarks to show you appropriate places for, whatever. This is a fertile area for attention in some way. You could do that with virtual landmarking.
So I have a question, maybe for you two, but maybe for someone else. So one of the things that we were thinking about with the shipping issue is that these ships run on a variety of different fuels, and we're trying to get a permanent change towards much more sustainable fuels, but they switch fuels, right? So in addition to being able, like we had a very small system that allowed us to track, was really funky and put together by volunteers, to track ships in Puget Sound that were carrying tar sands oil, and then we would kind of lose them at the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then they would show up elsewhere at certain times. It was very funky, but it was, some people really liked it because they would be out in the islands and they could see a tanker and say, that's a tar sands tanker. So that, that feels like that's something that's very possible. The thing I was wondering about is, because of the fuel switching, again, what we've seen over the last 20 years is government shrinking. There's no enforcement of fuel switching. But is there a way using satellite data to tell, like if you look at this ship, I mean.
What do you mean by fuel switching? A boat goes up next to it and they're like, okay, let me give you your fuel, and then you go off. And...
So this ship right here, it would still be horrendous, but there would not be a black plume of smoke when they're within certain distances of the shore, right? And then they switch to a different type of fuel once they're a dozen miles offshore. But nobody knows if they're actually complying with what they're...
Cheaper, more polluting.
Exactly. They mostly use heavy fuel oil, which is actually a solid at room temperature. It's like the grossest stuff you can possibly burn. But is it possible to, in addition to mapping the ships, could you figure out how to map what they're burning? Because there's a footprint, right? A visible footprint in many cases.
Well, I mean, as microsatellites become more common by some planet, for example, we're going to have an eye on the society is going to have an eye in the sky in more frequent intervals, and that's good because their mapping satellites are like 1 meter or 5 meters, like you can see every at least twice a day. Don't quote me, but you can imagine a world where you like twice or 3 times a day you could see that's a ship.
Yeah.
Like, wow, look at this plume. It's a half a mile long and it's this color. That's good. I don't know if we're quite there yet. I'm not a super expert, but we could, when we all talk, we could connect you with right people that would know more.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I actually come from a long line of sustainability work myself, and I was at the WTO conference in 1999, if you remember, in Seattle.
I was there. Tear gas.
Yeah, me too. And anyway, so I've been in the sustainability movement for a very long time. Ranging from United Nations conferences to the WTO to a lot of others. And what has struck me time and again is that every time I'd go to these conferences and then we'd go out for, some of us panelists or attendees would go out to dinner, and we'd leave the hotel and there's the real world. There are people walking on the street and they're looking at their iPhones and they're chatting. And I'm like, do they think about these things? And so over these years, and also because of a previous career in Hollywood, being kind of on, the other side of things and storytelling, it kind of dawned on me over time that what you really need is storytelling on a very emotional, very emotive level, right? So, and that has to start young. I mean, I have a 7-year-old daughter, and she loves Minecraft, but she also likes little birdies. I mean, she'll stop dead at, and just look at hummingbirds. And so I think if we can encourage in our children this very real connection to the real world, not just technology, right? It kind of has to go hand in hand, I think. Because if not, then we really become disconnected. And I see that. So what I'm actually actively doing is in my team trying to see, how can we use technology to tell these stories? Not overtly, not saying, hey, did you know that you should never go on a cruise ship because they pollute, but tell stories through mythology, through fiction, through narratives. I mean, I would love to see, Game of Thrones mention something about that. The Google Assistant.
Sorry, okay.
Yeah. And so, we reach out there, and we do have Earth, for example, we have Earth Day content And I also suggested, well, if you do Christmas holiday kind of suggestions, why don't you put in something about green Christmas, you know? And so my team liked that.
Yeah.
So even little tidbits like, hey, consider the packaging that you're buying, because
Yeah.
the gift wrapping, right, gets ripped off and off it goes. It's one use.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking about constantly, is how can we tell these kinds of very emotive stories, and as young as possible.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to brainwash, but it's how we're biologically wired. We're biologically wired for stories, for, you know, the stories of our elders. Our elders right now are movies,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah,
So
and the environmental movement needs a lot of help with stories because we're getting a little better at it, but you know, the story that everything is terrible and we're all going to die is really not working.
it never did.
But there's we have a campaign right now against Starbucks because of their cups. This is just an example of like to think about how we could tell this story better. So their cups are not recyclable. Everybody thinks they are. They're not. They go through 4 billion of them per year, and this is our cup wall, which we hang in front of their headquarters every once in a while, which is 8,181 cups, which is 1 minute of Starbucks cups. And so if you think about storytelling, so you have a forest, and then the process to make this cup, it's in your hand for 20 minutes, and then it's in the landfill forever.
Are they compostable?
Nope.
Why aren't they recyclable?
They're not, because they just haven't been sufficiently motivated, but we're getting there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a plastic liner.
I would think that they would
Yeah.
be.
I know. Well, the thing is, they're kind of like, you know, I joke about them being sort of like Canada. Like everybody, because of healthcare and the good things Canada does, they think they're environmental. Same thing with Starbucks, because they are really a good company as far as fair trade, good wages, pay for college, hire all sorts of, you know, different groups of post-military refugee. Like they're great, but they're terrible on this issue. And there's got to be a way to tell this story that's empowering and not like, oh, another bad thing. Because they're going to change. It's going to take us a little while, but they're going to change. But it's exactly, I think, the kind of thing that we need to tell in a better way. So tell me how to tell that story.
Thanks for the interesting talk. So in the spirit of what previous questioners have done, I'll start with my qualifications. I was camped at the Black Hole in the summer of '93. You'll know what that means. But my question is about transparency. And I'm wondering what the obstacles have been to that. For example, I would think a forest company wouldn't want its competitors knowing who its clients were, or a apparel company knowing, apparel companies' competitors knowing who its suppliers were. So,
Transparency is always impossible.
What obstacles have you run into with that, and what can we do about them?
We started tracking, or trying to track, extreme oil, so oil from the tar sands. And we were told by our allies, funders, and companies you could not track it. Like it was not possible. Not only did they not want it to be tracked, they don't want it. They didn't think it was possible to track. But if you think about it, it's a little bit like pulp and paper, which they also said was impossible. But it's all connected. Like with oil, it's even easier. It's a pipe. Like it's a pipe from one place to a refinery, and a pipe from there to somewhere else, and then eventually to trucks. So we started going about mapping it, not in the way you folks map it, but very sort of like notebooks and tracking a truck that left a certain refinery that we knew had tar sands, following it to a refueling station, and then seeing corporate semis come in and refuel there, thus linking them to the tar sands. And so we did that, and eventually we got all of these companies to agree to get off of using tar sands oil to fuel their fleets. They didn't like it because they don't want a lot of transparency. It results in a lack of control. And the whole idea that everything is a trade secret is insane. And that's what they usually trot out in one way or another. But what we have seen over the last 20 years is once transparency is sort of forced upon them, that they operate just fine. Everything from pulp, paper to 2x4s, like yes, there are some things that are actual trade secrets. 99% of what they say are trade secrets are not. And so we're willing to carve out that 1%, fine. You can keep that secret. But the world, I think, is going in this direction. And Google is one of the drivers. And I think that companies that are going to succeed in the next decade plus are going to be able to deal with it. And those that can't are going to suffer, I think, in the marketplace. And it's not something they're going to like or be comfortable with, but it's happening anyway. And every industry that we've seen, that we've worked with, has said it's impossible and then was able to deal with it. So I think it's more myth than anything else.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Paglia. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you for your questions and your ideas. Really appreciate it.